been a general practitioner and has a long health informatics career as well. He was a founding fellow of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. He's currently an honorary research fellow in clinical informatics and health outcomes at the University of Oxford. He's a member of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics Trustee Board. He's been the chair of the FCI Council, the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. He was the National Clinical Safety Lead for the GP to GP Record Transfer Project, which not all of you will know about, but that was a tremendous success in moving records from one GP practice to another electronically, which used not to be possible. He's been the co-chair of the RCGP, that's the Royal College of General Practitioners, and BMA, that's the BMA, British Medical Association, Joint GP IT Committee. That's a very illustrious committee. And he's also been the clinical advisor to Primis, which is a specialist team of health informaticians at the School of Medicine at Nottingham University. In other words, we're in very good hands indeed, and it's safe to say that John's contribution to health informatics has been well recognized. He received a prize from the RCGP in 2018, for his contributions to general practice clinical informatics. I don't know if you'd like me to say anything more about you, John, but I think your pedigree is very well established. So if you're okay, I'll hand over to you now, John. And as I said earlier, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer them at the end of John's talk. But we may not be able to deal with all of them.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's far too much about me. Welcome everybody to this first webinar in the BCS PRSB Health Informatics Standards Introductory Webinar Series. Just a very small plug, which Mike kindly allowed me to have. I am a founding fellow of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics. I think my colleagues would be delighted to know that somebody from the faculty is involved in this, because we see this as being a very important and interesting topic. If anybody wants to know anything more about the FCI, you can see on the slide here our website address, fci.org.uk, or if you simply Google anything similar to Faculty of Clinical Informatics, you'll get a hit almost at the top of the screen. So anyway, Charlie, I think you're going to be very kindly doing one click at a time for me. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is actually a play in two parts. The first part, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of this series of webinars. And the second part is entitled A Clinician's Perspective of Standards. Probably more truthful to say it's a clinical informatician's view of standards. So without more ado, I'm going to just work through the headings as they are outlined on the screen here. Next slide, please. So what I just want to say is that when I put these slides together, there were one or two people who were rather worried that I had put it together in a way that raised an awful lot of difficulties and made the topic look extremely difficult and complicated. And they wondered if I could do something to make it simpler. Well, I'm afraid that that's not possible, because there's a limit to how far you can simplify anything that's complicated and complex. It is a difficult area, and that's actually why we need a series of webinars like this. But please don't be put off by the fact that it is difficult, because the whole point of this series is to throw light on the whole field of standards and to make them much more accessible and easy to understand than is the case. So please don't be put off. What I'm hoping I can do is to enthuse you in this and encourage you to want to know more. So next slide, please. So it's actually not easy to talk about what is and is not in scope. It's much easier to talk about what's out of scope. But what we're aiming to do is to talk about standards that are specific to the health and care domain, and which, sorry, we've gone, can we go back? Go back. No, wrong way. Back. No, that's it with that. Sorry, bit of a delay. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about standards that are specific to the health and care domain and which generally apply to data, apps, or other products. And we're going to loosely refer to those as health informatics standards. There isn't actually any single straightforward and agreed way to classify IT and data standards in health, and we're not going to attempt to do that. More importantly, each webinar in these series will work to a title in the form of a question, and will address a group of standards relevant to answering that question. So really what's in scope is going to be defined by all the standards that form the answers to the questions in the later sets of webinars in this series. So it's a very loose definition. It's just a collective title for all of the standards that we want to talk about here. Let's go on to the next slide and look at what's not in scope, because that's easier to deal with. So we're not going to be talking about professional standards in this webinar series, except that I will be talking about it later in the second half of this, and to explain what they are and how they fit into the standards ecosystem. We're not going to be covering generic technical or product standards, things like HTML, SMTP, IMAP, the sorts of standards that relate to the internet and the World Wide Web. They're not in scope. We're not going to be talking about data quality and metadata standards or management standards, whether domain specific or generic. And we're not going to be covering process modeling standards such as Business Process Modeling Plus. BCS will be running a separate series of webinars about those at some later stage. Next slide, please. So here are some of the challenges that people encounter when they're getting to grips with health informatics standards. And I should say that that's definitely not limited just to novices. I think everybody has difficulty with standards of some form or another. So it can be difficult to get good quality guidance about individual health informatics standards. Usually, nearly all standards will need to be used in combination with other standards. So it isn't just a matter of knowing about one standard, you need to know about more than one standard and how they all work together. And then there's a need for an understanding of which standards are relevant to a particular use case and ensuring that they are appropriately implemented in any use case, and that can be challenging too. It's definitely the case that many health informatics standards can't be implemented straight out of the box. And there's the problem that standards documents are intended to be definitive and unambiguous. And so typically they are drafted in a way that isn't easy to read. So this is definitely an area where it helps to be able to talk to somebody who is expert. It helps to be able to phone a friend if you've got one. But I'm hoping that future speakers talking about standards will be able to provide people with some leads as to how they can find good quality guidance and get around some of these problems. So moving on to the next slide, please. So the aims and objectives of this webinar series, as Mike said earlier on, broadly to provide an introduction to health informatics standards, explaining what they are, what their importance is, and what benefits they can bring, to increase knowledge and understanding, not just of individual standards, but of the whole overall field. We want to see if we can start the creation of a long-term resource for future learners. And out of this, maybe some ideas will come about how the specification and implementation of standards could be improved. Could I have the next slide, please? So now what I'm going to do is just to tell you a little bit about what you can expect coming up in future, tell you some of the titles. Today's webinar is the one at the top, obviously. The next webinar will be entitled What Information is Needed for Care for Patients and Service Users, and that will be about professional record standards body standards, and I think Charlie McKay will be talking a little bit about that towards the end of this session, because I think he's going to be giving that webinar. That's the next webinar. Then later there's a webinar about how we standardize or code clinical and drug information. So that's about terminologies. The next one is about how we move information around that's needed to provide care, and how do we find information. So that will be about things like FHIR and messaging and probably APIs. And then there's one about how do we ensure safety. Next slide, please. Then we're going to send everybody off to enjoy their summer holidays. When you come back from your summer holidays, there's a whole new set of things that you can come back for, look forward to. A webinar on how do we model and structure health information in systems, which is about the sort of semantics and syntax of information in systems rather than how it's stored in systems. I'm not going to say any more about that just at the moment, because that could take a long time. Next one will be about security, including confidentiality and privacy. And then we have another, which is about identifying people, places, and organizations uniquely. So that will cover things like the NHS number. Next one will be about how we get population health statistics, manage contracts and reimbursement. Next one about standards that we use for research and analytics. And then a final one, which will be about who develops standards, who sets and imposes standards, which I suspect will be also of great interest. So can we then move on, please? Next slide. Thank you. So the next bit is clinician's perspective of standards. So now what I'm going to try to do is to give you an overview of how these health informatics standards look to me as a clinician, clinical informatician. So I'm going to tell you what I think we mean by standards, so what I found out about that, a bit about professional standards and how they're completely different from health informatics standards, then about why we need health informatics standards to support patient journeys, a little bit about different types of standards and how they relate to each other, and then finally a little bit about why standards on their own are not enough. There needs to be more than just standards. So next slide, please. So here's the thing, what exactly is a standard? So actually, it's not an easy question to answer. And I went looking for dictionary definitions. It seems to be a word with many meanings. So it comes from the Middle English, estandard, meaning a banner. And top of the line seems to be the idea that a standard is a conspicuous object carried at the top of a pole, a rallying point. But it could also be a standard lamp or a standard rose. The next meaning is it's something established by authority, custom, or general consent as a model or example. I'll come back to that one in just a second. Another possibility is it's something set up and established by authority as a rule for the measure of quantity, weight, extent, value, or quality. Well, that's pretty obvious. There are obviously all sorts of weights and measures and things around that are governed by standards. But here are a few interesting ones. A standard is something that's usable but not of top quality. So not substandard and not deluxe, it's just standard, it's usable. So that might be of some significance or relevance to standards. I'll come back to that in a second. Regularly and widely used, available or supplied, well established and familiar. There are an awful lot of people who would love to be able to say that health informatics standards are well established and very familiar. Sadly, that's not the case. Having recognized and permanent value. So anyway, that may sound a little bit flippant in parts, but I think that probably the definition that comes nearest is the third one, something established by authority, custom, or general consent as a model or example. And that's interesting because it suggests that something established by authority is imposed from the top down, mandated and imposed, but it also has the opposite suggestion, that it's something that's produced by general consent, general consensus, bottom up, rather as, for example, has happened very much in the standards around internet and World Wide Web. So I think that third one is probably getting pretty close to what we mean by a standard, the sort of standards we're talking about here. But anyway, can we move on to the next slide, please? Because the next thing I want to do is just to talk a little bit about professional standards compared with health informatics standards. So first of all, a professional standard applies to humans. They're about expected behavior, values, ethical issues, and culture. For some professions, healthcare professions in particular, they're backed up by statutory regulators. As a doctor, I have to abide by the GMC's code of behavior. And if I am badly in breach of that, I can get struck off. And that's all in place to protect the public. There are many different codes of practice which form professional informatics, standards. We're not going to be looking at those any further in this series, but they do contribute to the standards ecosystem in which health informatics standards operate. And I'm going to try and demonstrate that in just a second. What is very much important and covered in the rest of this series are the health informatics standards, and they generally apply to data, apps, or other products, so not to humans. And of course, they're specific to the health and care domain. Next slide, please. So what I thought we'd do is just a quick look at the GMC Good Medical Practice Code, which is essentially a standard that all doctors have to abide by. And these are the core bits of it, which give you a very clear idea of what a professional standard is about. Make the care of your patient your first concern. Be competent and keep your professional knowledge and skills up to date. Take prompt action if you think patient safety is being compromised. Establish and maintain good partnerships with your patients and colleagues. Maintain trust in you and the profession by being open, honest, and acting with integrity. So that just gives you an idea of what is a professional standard. Next slide, please. So out of that, there's a lot more in this code of behavior, but there are 4 domains, and they're listed here. So I've just picked some excerpts from that, which I think actually do have quite a steer on our discussion today about standards. So under knowledge, skills, and performance, I'm expected to develop and maintain my professional performance. I need to record my work clearly, accurately, and legibly. I need to contribute, under safety and quality, need to contribute to and comply with systems to protect patients. There's a lot about communication, partnership, and teamwork, collaborative working, continuity and coordination of care. And finally, a lot about maintaining trust, showing respect for patients, acting with honesty and integrity. Next slide, please. So I think that has implications for information system requirements. If I'm expected to do those things, then I need the information systems that will help me to do those things. So we need clear, accurate, and legible, which I think really means accessible records, electronic records. They need to be person-centered, particularly patient-centered. They need to be safe. They need to encourage good quality care. We definitely have to have good security, protection of confidentiality and privacy, effective communication, collaboration, partnership, teamwork, continuity and coordination of care, development and maintenance of professional performance, and I would suggest encourage and monitor for honesty and integrity. For example, in GP systems, there's a very sophisticated audit trail, and it was that sophisticated audit trail that ultimately tripped up Harold Shipman and enabled people to catch him out and deal with him, basically. So next slide, please. So basically, patient records, I'm going to look at those next. They're complex things, and they're not just lakes of data items. People tend to assume that they're just lakes of data items. They hold many different kinds of information, and within that, there's a major importance about representing the context around bits of information, provenance, which is all about who actually laid down the record, what role did they have, how trustworthy is the information that they've added to the record. And then there are things like clinical fragments and expressions. Clinical fragment, I mean things like blood pressure or a drug allergy, which are things that basically we can come to an agreement about what are the attributes of those things that we need to have collected together. And there are various expressions. What do I mean by that? Well, maybe I could use as an example of that a PRSB standard known as EPACS, which is an electronic palliative care coordination system. So that our systems need to be able to handle and represent the structures and content of such things. And they also contain knowledge. So for example, I've just talked about context and provenance. Knowledge is about how those are linked up with concepts and how concepts generally are related and linked together. And there's also knowledge in systems that's used to drive decision support. So they aren't just, records are not just lakes of data items. They are much more about very sophisticated information and knowledge. Next slide, please. So here very quickly, some examples of the different kinds of clinical information you'll find in a typical GP system, and probably a lot of other systems as well. Not an exhaustive list. And every one of these has quite different attributes, quite different characteristics. I'm not going to say any more about that because time's moving on. So next slide, please. So lots of different kinds of information. The next thing is that the creation, maintenance, and usage of records involve many people, different organizations, different professions, different uses of language, different worldviews. So further complexity there. Next slide, please. And records have many purposes. Next slide, please. So there is an RCGP paper, Shared Record Professional Guidance Report. That lists more than 20 purposes for health records. Now that might be specific to general practice, but a lot of people in other walks of life will recognize a lot of the purposes. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to have a look at the clinical purposes. I just need to make an apology. I had hoped to be able to give you a URL to this Shared Record Professional Guidance. It's sitting somewhere on the RCGP website, but the link to it has been broken for about 12 months, and therefore it's not accessible. So here's an example of how frustrating it can be when you want to find information about something. We're doing our best to try and get that sorted out. Next slide, let's move on and look at clinical purposes. So the first set of clinical purposes are clinical purposes that facilitate the clinical care of individual patients. So it includes things like acting as an aid memoir for the health professional during subsequent consultations, making information available to others with access to the record system who are involved in the care of the same patient, providing information for inclusion in other documents like lab requests, referrals, and medical reports, and the other way around, storing information coming in, received from other parties or organizations, like lab results and letters from specialists. And then we've got transfer of the record to any NHS practice with which the patient subsequently registers. That's the GP record and the GP to GP record transfer that Mike was talking about right back at the beginning. And generally providing information to patients about their health and care. Next slide, please. And then for assisting in the care of practice population, that's about assessing the health needs of the population, identifying target groups, enabling call and recall programs, monitoring the progress of health promotion initiatives, providing patients with an opportunity to contribute to their records, supporting medical audit. So when you think about it, this actually altogether means that GP records form an important source of data for secondary uses. And that's a topic that I think will get covered later in the series, the standards that relate to that. Next slide, please. So the final bit that I want to raise is that records are dynamic. Patients' histories are evolving all the time and changing. So records change with time. So systems have to be really good at handling dates right across the system, not just in the end systems where data is laid down, but in any transfer, dates have to be well handled. Next slide, please. So this is just looking at the whole lot together, just to make the point about how complex records can be. So what I now want to do is to look at communicating and sharing and moving of information, which is another complex area. Next slide, please. So much of this relates to interoperability, which is another major and complex domain. There are lots of different definitions for interoperability. And one that I tend to work to is interoperability is the ability of two or more systems to exchange information and to use the information exchanged. And that is a quote from Tim Benson and Graham Greaves' Principles of Health Interoperability. And I'm telling you that's where it comes from, because otherwise I may find that our co-hosts debate as to whether or not that is necessarily the right definition. There are lots of definitions, but that's the one that I tend to work to. Before you have interoperability, you've got to have operable systems. They've got to be fit for purpose end systems, and they've got to contain the information that's necessary for all of this to work. So that means you have to have users who are good at using the end systems, and that won't happen if they're not fit for purpose. Interoperability can be viewed in layers. There's a technical layer, which essentially doesn't know or care about the meaning of what's exchanged. It's just looking at bits and bytes. It's the next level that becomes really interesting, which is semantic level, which is all about meaning and syntax. And the definition for that could be ability to import utterances from another computer without prior notification and have your decision support, data queries, and business rules continue to work reliably against these utterances. How on earth could you possibly achieve that unless you had standards? I'm not going to go into the process in clinical. Ideally, systems should be designed to be interoperable from the start. Can we have the next slide, please? So two things that always strike me as being relevant to standards in this particular area of moving data around. Problems of combinatorial explosion if we let everybody do their own thing. So if you think about it, and you have links between systems going back and forth, then if you have A and B, you have a link from A to B, and you then have to have another link back from B to A. And if you just have two, of course, you've just got two links. But if you've got four systems, you've then got 12 links. I think that's right, isn't it? Yes, 12 links. 6 in one direction and 6 coming back the other way. So very rapidly, the numbers go up, and hence the idea of combinatorial explosion. The other thing that relates to this is the costs of doing all of this. It might be seen to be the cheapest way might be to create your own link, do your own thing, to create a link with one or two systems. But because of this combinatorial explosion, that very quickly becomes very costly, and it's unlikely to scale. In contrast, implementing a standard way of moving data around can be very costly to start with, but in the end it is probably going to be a far better option cost-wise. So next slide, please. So here is a graphic that I think rather nicely illustrates what we're talking about here. So on the left, you've got 6 systems. And if you look at the arrows around each of those 6 systems, there are 5 arrows pointing in to each of those. So 6 5s makes 30 links. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, you've got a central star, a standard intermediary. We have 6 systems now all reading and writing to that one standard. You've just got, what is that, 12 links. So that's a great improvement on the 30 in the first. And the more systems there are, the greater that difference becomes. Next slide, please. I think that's a pretty good argument for standardization. And then you can look at interoperability costs. So here's an interesting one about the cost of doing interoperability and the number of interfaces you have. So you can see when you've got a very low number of interfaces, it's probably cheaper just to do your own thing and not spend a lot of money investing in a standard. But as soon as you're involved with greater numbers, then although the initial cost is far higher in doing a standard-based solution, when you add extra systems to that, the cost of doing that is far less than the cost if you do bespoke interfaces all the time. Next slide, please. Okay, so from a clinician's point of view, what kind of standards are we talking about? So I think when I'm talking to people like this, I tend to think about this as there being a big three, which sit in the center of everything. And the big three are terminologies that frame language and code it, and they help us to get around the not inconsiderable problems of handling natural language. Natural language processing is getting cleverer and cleverer every year, but we still really need terminologies to frame language and to code it, to group things around concepts. So that's the first one. The second one is architecture, and that's to structure and organize the way that clinical information is handled and presented to users. I don't mean how it's actually laid out on the screen. I mean the logic of the meaning, the semantics, and the syntax of the information in a system. And that can be quite different from the technical way that information is stored deeper down in systems. I'm expecting that in a later webinar, all of that will become much clearer and be explained. And then the third one is about messaging. And that's about moving information from one place to another and enabling that, single central star that I showed you a moment ago, such that any system simply has to work out how to read and write just once to that central star, and how much simpler that is. And I think those sit at the heart of everything. Generally, all three hopefully working in harmony together. And that's the core of both operable and interoperable systems, as I, as a clinical informatician, see it. Next slide, please. What we then have is a whole array of other standards that play their parts around those big three. So, for example, that would include PRSB record standards, which define the professional requirements for information content of specific use cases. Talked about EPACs a moment ago, hospital to GP discharge summary would be another one. And no doubt you will hear next in the next webinar of many others as well. Reliable identification of patients, people in general, places and organizations. Well, that's amongst other things, the NHS number. Clinical safety, security, confidentiality, and privacy. Now you notice that I'm picking things there that are not dissimilar to the things that I pointed to after looking at the professional standard. And I don't think there's any accident that there's a similarity between these things. And all of these things, what was on the last slide and what's on this slide and more, are going to be covered later in the webinar series. Next slide, please. So then a little bit about this business about standards not being quite enough on their own. So I just want to come back to this business about mandating. So mandating has its place, no question about that. But for example, mandating vendors to support a particular standard isn't going to get very far. Mandating that it entails a lot of other things is really important. The best way, I think, to do this is to be mandating something around a use case. And if you pick a use case that everybody which represents a problem that everyone wants to get fixed, then you will have general consensus around that. And if you have a combination of mandation around a use case, general consensus, and the mandating process also removes stumbling blocks such that people and organizations are incentivized to use them, adequate funding and resources are provided or available, you have the right people with the right knowledge and skills to support, there's a clear overarching strategy. If you put all of those things together, then you're in with a chance of things actually succeeding. And of course, you also need to tackle the kinds of challenges that we enumerated in the first section of this webinar. So that is not in any way to say that standards are unimportant. They are not. They are very important and very necessary. But I think all of these other things, and quite a lot of other things besides, also need to be considered. Next slide, please. So basically, this is now the end of the presentation. I'm hoping what I've succeeded in doing is to give you an introduction to this series and then a quick clinician's perspective, taking in what we mean by standards, what the difference is between professional health informatics standards, why we need health informatics standards to support patient journeys, a little bit about why it's difficult, different types of standard and how they relate to each other, and the fact that standards are not ends in themselves. So I hope that's been helpful, and I hope that it has enthused you and will encourage you to want to come to future webinars in the series. Next slide, please. So we're on to any questions.
Excellent. John, thank you very much indeed. That was truly insightful, really helpful. Always interesting to see the clinician's view of these things, and very much appreciated. I've been looking at the chat and we haven't seen a huge number of questions, though I have seen one about health informatics interviews, which I might answer later. Yes, indeed, somebody's just mentioned FedIP, so we'll come back to that in a little while. But I think probably the best thing to do now is for Charlie, if that's okay with you, Charlie, to just say a little bit about the next webinar. And what you're bringing up, are you bringing up some slides, Charlie?
I'm not, but
okay. In which case,
technical challenges stopped me.
Okay. Well, in which case, feel free to would you like to improvise now, or would you like?
I'll improvise briefly, just really to echo your thanks to John for an excellent introduction. And I really like the definitions of standards. And I picked out the standards as a rallying point, actually, as being something that was really worth emphasizing, and would have been the one that I would have picked if I had to pick one as the best definition, because I think standards as the totem for the community around the standards and who use that standard is a really important piece, because it is the community using the standard agreeing to engage with each other through using the standard that's important, I think. And I think it's a real danger is that people see standards as PDFs or documents and contractual items rather than as things that facilitate collaboration. And just to sort of briefly mention the PRSB, why the PRSB wanted to be involved with this series of webinars was because the PRSB is an organization owned by the Royal Colleges and patient organizations. Its mandate is to define information standards and record standards for health and care. And those record standards, what information we record and we look for in our records when we engage in health and care. So I do that as a patient, clinicians and care workers do it as professionals. What goes into those records and what's looked for in those records is vital to effective collaboration and effective healthcare, and it is a visceral part of how we deal with illness and health. And I think that combination of those professional standards, what people do, and professional record standards, what the records do, I think need to be entangled. And I think John brought that out nicely. And the next webinar in the series is going to be by Nilesh, who's the the clinical director of the PRSB. So another clinical view on standards, but focusing on those information standards. But what is it that we want to get from our records, however those records are kept, and irrespective of the technology used. And my enthusiasm for the PRSB standards is that decoupling of the specification for the information from the technology or the way that it's stored and shared and manipulated, because those technologies change fairly quickly, but the information, what we talk about when we talk about maternity, or what we talk about when we talk about diabetes, is fairly consistent over time and needs to be consistent across technologies and different standards that apply to it. So that seminar in 2 weeks' time, the same time as this Thursday evening, will be covering those professional record standards and how they are relevant and used. And do we have some other questions?
Yeah, there's some interesting things cropping up in the chat here. So Alex Wren has asked what we think about the state of interoperability in the NHS. Where should it be, and could it be, and what could improve it? And do we need it with EHR systems? So I'm quite happy to weigh in on that one. But if you, Charlie or John, would like to say anything, feel free.
I think the silence is because where do we start in that one? I think it's got a long way to go. I think it could be a lot better than it is at the moment, but it's very easy to be critical and carping about it. I think what's underlying the question is how can we actually go about improving things? And it's not easy quickly to come up with a simple solution, but part of the solution, I suspect, is to have some greater clarity about a strategy around standards, maybe to have that focused more on use cases than on the standards themselves, because there's been a tendency, I think in the past, to say every GP system must support SNOMED. Well, every GP system in England now does support SNOMED, but have they implemented it fully? Absolutely no, they have not. Absolutely not. We still have the problems that we were promised would get solved. So again, easy to whinge about that. But so fixing things around use cases, and when you fix things around a use case, be realistic about it. People can't do that from nothing. They can't do it out of thin air. They can't do it at midnight, between midnight and 2 o'clock, and still be expected to do a full day's work the next day. So resources need, the things I put in my slide, all of those things need to be sorted out. And of course, the trouble is that involves quite a lot of investment. And right now is not a good time to be looking for that kind of investment. But nevertheless, some projects that I think of which have billions attached to them, if instead of going for very big projects, instead several hundred much smaller projects were done, we might actually make a lot more progress. We might actually be able to pick off the low-hanging fruit and make a lot more progress much quicker.
And the other thing that I'd probably say is that we shouldn't treat interoperability or digital projects in isolation. That digital technology and certainly information standards are part of a collaborating community working together. And so any digital project needs to be part of a change program. And so I think we need to look at interoperability in the context of places where people are trying to work together. And it doesn't all have to be done at a national level. We don't have to wait for national policies. It is something that can be done as part of those change programs. And the other piece is that it's no use having interoperability if you don't talk about things in the same way at either end of that interoperability. So every interoperability project has to start with, are we talking about the same things? Do we have common expectations when someone sees a piece of information about how they're going to behave? Because if you don't get that common practice around the information, then there's no point sharing it. In fact, it's possibly dangerous to share information that's going to be misinterpreted when it's received at the other end.
Okay, thanks. I'd just add that I think having large EHR systems in hospitals and other places may or may not be a good idea, but you still need interoperability because you've got to interact with all sorts of other organisations outside your hospital, social care organisations, other healthcare organisations, primary care, tertiary hospitals, etc., etc. So interoperability is absolutely essential, whether or not you've got large EHR systems in place in hospitals. I'd just like to pick up the question that was raised about interviews for health informatics jobs, and somebody mentioned FedIP. So one of the reasons that we're having these webinars is because we as the BCS have been asked many times to help people understand standards, particularly people who started out earlier in their health informatics or clinical informatics careers. And if you want to get into this area, and if you want to know about what sorts of things you might be asked and the sort of work you might be end up doing, then I suggest you look at the website for the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, FCI, the website for FedIP, that's the Federation of Informatics Professionals in Health and Care. You could also look at the BCS Health and Care web pages, and that you'll be able to pick up quite a lot from that. There is now a plethora of comments in the chat, which I'm having difficulty keeping up with. Charlie or John, have you picked up any particular questions that would be worth picking up in the last few minutes that we've got?
I would certainly recommend people reading the chat and good pointers to work that's going on in Wales, and some heartwarming support for the series of webinars. So do please encourage your friends to come along as well. And I would add to Mike's list the PRSB website, obviously, as a place where you can find relevant information. And there are implementation toolkits alongside the PRSB standards which talk about how to use the standards.
Yes, of course, the PRSB website is a very good resource, particularly for the PRSB standards. I was specifically referring to areas where health informaticians can look at what their career might involve and so on and so forth. And I should also say, from memory, I haven't looked recently, there's quite a lot of good information about health informatics as a career on the NHS jobs website or somewhere like that. I can't remember exactly, but a bit of Googling, you'll find quite a lot about it.
There was one comment in the chat asking, am I right in thinking that GP IT Futures sorted out the semantics of describing medical conditions between all the Royal Colleges?
Before you answer that, John, I think you should. I realised that you could spend quite a long time answering it, but we've only got a couple of minutes left. So if you'd like to answer it very briefly, because I think it's an excellent question, that'd be great. But then I'm going to have to wind up the session, I think.
I hate to say it, but I think there's a very short answer, and it's no. I'm not quite sure. I'm trying to think what that's pointing at, but I don't believe that that's the case. Can I just switch to very quickly another point?
Of course.
The comment: I believe interoperability should not be limited to clinician EHR systems alone. Digital health apps being developed should be added to the works too. Just wanted to emphasize how much I agree with that. There was no intent in my presentation to suggest that EPRs were the only thing. I was using that as an example, a vehicle to get into the standards area. But you're absolutely right. It's much more than just EHRs. A lot of health apps are going to be feeding information into EHRs or taking information out from. Might just go back to Charlie to see if Charlie has any ideas as to what is behind the question about semantics of describing medical conditions between all the Royal Colleges. To me, that's a massive area. In the faculty, we've been doing some work about diagnoses and problems, and those are really thorny areas to sort out. Because when you talk about problems, even between different doctors and different disciplines, they don't mean the same thing.
So I think there was a belief. I remember when we were doing GP record transfer that we thought once you'd defined the semantics of a GP record sufficiently to be able to transfer it to another practice, that would give you a shareable, reusable patient record that would work across health and social care. I think that was grossly naive of us. And I think that, that naivety would still exist, that a GP record is part of the health and care record, but it's only a part of it. And even if that was well understood, standardized and consistent across the country. And that's a very big even if. There's an awful lot of other information that matters that never finds its way into the GP record. And I'd certainly agree that what happens in patient-held apps, patient-held information is vitally important as well. So I think there's a lot more to be said. And luckily, we've got a whole load more webinars to cover that in. So I'll hand back to Mike to wrap us up.
Indeed. Okay, so thanks, Charlie. So yes, just to very quickly mention that the whole issue of apps, wearable devices, all that sort of stuff, that's going to lead to an explosion of data and information, and it's all got to end up somewhere in order to be used. So yes, we will be talking about that, and we'll be talking about something called software as a medical device, which is quite an interesting standards area as well later in the series. But I need to wrap it up now. I'd like to thank John very much indeed for what I thought was an outstanding webinar, very much appreciated. And there have been some very positive comments in the chat in case you hadn't seen them. So thank you again. Thank you to Charlie for helping out. And all I need to do now is to thank you all for attending and your interest. That's very much appreciated. We hope you found it useful. And as Charlie said, the next one is on the 8th of June. Unfortunately, we can't put the link in because of our slight technical problems, but if you look at the BCS events diary, you'll find it readily enough. And then the next one after that, very briefly, will be a fortnight later, and that will cover things like SNOMED, ICD-10, and such like. And if those acronyms sound a bit much, they are part of the landscape, unfortunately, but we will be explaining them to you. And then the one after that, the date of which isn't in front of me at the moment, will be about FHIR. So again, many thanks to to John for the presentation, and to Charlie for helping out. And look forward to seeing you and any colleagues who want to learn about health informatics standards in the near future. And that is it. Sorry, just want to say, we will be putting the presentation online, and we will be putting the recording online as soon as we can. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Mike. Bye all.
Thank you.